Welcome to Terrifying Tales, the channel dedicated to telling original horror stories. Antarctic Wolf. East Antarctica, north of the Amory Shelf, 29th of July, 1977. Manya Petrov stomped in the snow as the icy wind cut across the shelf. "Come on," she muttered. This was her first winter at the Soviet Antarctic base Salyut. Right now she was waiting for Oleg and Igor to return from tending to the dogs. Manya stared longingly back at the door to the main building. She'd known the mission would be difficult, but still considered herself naive. Sun doesn't rise during the Antarctic winter. There was still over a month to go. A person can try to imagine how cold a desert of ice and wind can be, but expectation pales to reality in that regard, or so Manya found out. Without the sun, temperatures plummet. Manya experienced temperatures of -30 some days. The moon stretched across the horizon. Everything for Manya appeared in reverse. The moon sat low in place of the rising sun. The fact the moon was upside down was something she never got used to. Her sigh released a cloud of mist as Oleg and Igor's silhouettes trudged into view. Manya stepped back to the door in anticipation, willing the men to hurry. A sharp howl cut through the night. The hairs on Manya's neck stood on end beneath her jacket. The howl of a wolf Manya was familiar with. This wasn't the high-pitched call of the pack. There was a guttural pitch to this call. Angry. Hungry. Manya cuddled her arms to her chest. She knew there weren't any native wolves here. Oleg and Igor picked up their pace. Their silhouettes were out of sync. Their arms were working faster than their legs. The snow felt no need to cooperate with their need for haste. A second howl cut through the air. Manya wanted to go inside. Her body refused to move. Something else was out there with Oleg and Igor. Something larger blocked their silhouettes out for a fraction of a second as it circled them. Their muffled, panicked cries carried to Manya's ears as they drew closer to the base. One of their silhouettes disappeared from sight. A high-pitched scream pierced the night. "Manya, open the door!" Oleg screamed as he closed in. Manya remained still, her eyes focused on the black shape tearing Igor apart in the snow. "Open the door!" Two white eyes like fireflies locked with Manya's. It was enough to break terror's hold. The beast charged toward them. Manya opened the door. Warmth from inside kissed her face. The beast was uninhibited by the snow. It gained ground toward Oleg at frightening speed. "Hurry!" Manya screamed. Tears filled her eyes. Her body trembled against the doorframe. He was going to make it. Manya stepped back as Oleg gripped the doorframe. His eyes grew wide. Oleg disappeared into the dark. Manya's eyes found Oleg's hand gripping the doorframe, the only part of the man that remained. Blood trickled from the torn wrist stump to the snow. Manya stood trembling, unable to move. Oleg's lifeless body landed on top of her, knocking her to the floor. Manya barely registered the weight. Shock had taken hold. Heavy breathing entered the doorway. The enormous foot wielding razor-sharp claws hit the floor inches from her face. Manya heard the heavy breathing as it passed by. When she could hear it no longer, it was replaced with screams of panic echoing through the base. "This is Mawson Station. Do you read me? Over." The transmissions had ceased a few minutes ago. "Salyut, this is Mawson. Can you read me?" Robert Johnson continued trying. He was pretty sure it was the Soviets. He understood a little Russian. "Keep trying." Diana Morgan paced the radio room. "Tell me again what you think you heard." "Mawson to Salyut. Over." Nothing but static. "It's like I said. I couldn't understand much, but it sounded horrible. There was screaming, stuff breaking. The only words I'm pretty sure about were dead, injured, and assist." Diana slumped in the chair against the wall. "Are you sure it was Salyut?" Robert gave up and sat the mic down. He swiveled away from the radio in his chair to face Diana. "Pretty sure. I mean, it has to be." They're the only station close enough to get a signal through in this weather, and to be completely honest, I can't believe their signal made it this far. Diana's eyes drifted. Something she did automatically when she needed to make an important decision. Her eyes found Robert again. Keep trying to raise them. The sound of Robert transmitting followed her along the corridor. Am I about to make a mistake? She wondered. Zach Russell was leaning back on his desk chair, his feet on the desk, his eyes closed, when Diana walked into the medical room. Sorry to interrupt, Doc, she said. Oh, you know me. Never a minute to spare, he replied. His eyes remained closed. Most who met him assumed the nickname Doc stemmed from his position as Mawson's medical officer. In fact, it stemmed from his preferred cigarette brand of Holiday. I want you to take some guys and head to Salyut. Doc's feet dropped to the floor. That opened his eyes. You what? There's a situation at Salyut. Diana sat on the end of the bed closest to Doc. He would have questions. She wasn't sure she was making the right decision herself, so the least she could do was to provide some answers. What kind of situation, Diana? I mean, what is it that's important enough to leave this base without medical care? Diana sighed. He was right. It was a gigantic risk. I don't know much. We received a transmission from the Soviets about 20 minutes ago. Robert couldn't make out much. A lot of screaming, a lot of crashing. From what little Russian he knows, Robert thinks there's possibly people dead, injured, and they were asking for help. Diana started pacing the room. We're all the way out at the edge of the world, middle of winter, and we're the only ones within a bull's roar of them. You sure about this, Diana? I mean, there's only 19 of us here at the moment. Something happens out there, you're out 5 men, including your medical officer. You'll be in the same boat as the Soviets. There's no help coming until well into spring, if not summer. Diana shook her head. No, Doc, I'm not. Well, then why am I going? Diana brought her hands to her face and sighed. Because I need to sleep at night. There's people in trouble, and they die because I did nothing. I'll never forgive myself. Doc's stare was famous on the base. He locked eyes with Diana. The ice in his eyes matched the environment perfectly. You're not doing anything, Diana. You're making us do it. Diana stopped pacing. No one had challenged her command before. Have you thought about how you'd feel if they're already dead out there and you're just adding extra bodies? She hadn't. But she wasn't going to admit that to Doc. Diana also wasn't going to admit that his comment had cut hard. I hate that he's right, she realised. That's why I'm going with you, Doc. It was Doc's turn to be shocked. That's even more insane. So the base risks losing its medic and its leader. I've made up my mind, Doc. I'll get the rest of our team. You pack what you'll need and meet me in the maintenance shed in 20. Diana walked out, tired of arguing. Doc was the last to arrive in the maintenance shed. No one noticed when he walked through the door. His bag hit the concrete with a thud, drawing their attention. Billy Mitchell was busy checking the engine of the Weasel. Of course, Doc thought. Why take the good transport when we can risk the Antarctic winter in something older than I am? Breaking down and freezing to death was bound to make their adventure more exciting. Pete Douglas was seated against the wall cleaning his rifle. His gut made the perfect table for the task. The last member of the team was Eddie Yardley. He was talking to Diana beside the Weasel. If ever there was a man who stood a chance of surviving outside in the Antarctic winter, it was Eddie. His dishevelled beard hung low, reminiscent of the Australian bushrangers from history. Glad you could join us, Doc, Diana said. She's still pissed at me. Doc knew. She's mad because she knows I'm right. How we looking, Billy? She said. Billy slammed the hood of the Weasel down. We should be good. Eddie jumped in the driver's seat and fired the engine. The vehicle couldn't speak, but the laboured start let everyone know its thoughts about being woken. Right, we all know where we're going and why, Diana shouted over the engine. Let's not dawdle at the base. We get in, help if we can, and we get out. Pete lumbered into the Weasel, rifle slung over his shoulder. Expecting trouble? Doc asked. Pete ignored the question. Diana turned to Doc as she jumped in. We don't know what to expect. I'd prefer we have a gun and not need it, than need it and not have it. Doc nodded and climbed aboard. The Weasel crawled out of the shed. Eddie waited for Billy to close the roller door and join them. The storm, by Antarctic winter standards, was light. As the wind cut through, the snowfall billowed. The full moon on the horizon gave them extra visibility, helping the Weasel's lights. On the eastern coast, the temperature was significantly warmer than it was inland. But that was like calling a swim off the Antarctic coast safer than a swim in an active volcano. If the Weasel died, they'd freeze to death slightly slower, but they'd die without rescue nonetheless. How many fuel cans you got behind you there, Doc? Eddie called. Isn't that something you should have thought about before we left? Doc said, turning back. There's 7. Eddie chuckled. I double-checked, but you can never check too often. Those were the last words spoken on the drive. Anyone can act brave, but they all knew how dangerous this trip was. Doc decided if nervous tension created warmth, they'd be fine for months in the Weasel if it broke down. We should be able to see the base by now, Diana said. Even with the snow, we should be able to see the lights. No one else spoke. They all knew Diana was right. The Weasel crawled along the snow. Are we sure we're going the right way? Pete grumbled. Oh no, of course not, Pete, Eddie said. I'm just guessing and hoping for the best. It's so sunny and mild out, I figured it won't matter if we get lost. Enough, Diana said. It's just up ahead. Doc leaned over the front seat for a better look. Sure enough, silhouettes of buildings were just able to be made out on the horizon. Well, either they've lost power, there's no one there, or both. I don't like this, Billy whispered as they drew closer. They would have heard the Weasel by now, even over the weather. Somebody should have come out to meet us. Diana bit down gently on her lip as she thought. We've come all the way out here now. We'll check it out. We know someone was here. They were using the radio not long ago. Eddie pulled the Weasel up short of the base. The whines and howls from the kennel were instant. The dogs are still here, Billy said. Diana handed out torches. These won't do much. Just don't get too far away from each other. She was already feeling the cold through her clothes. Billy, you and Eddie check the kennel and the bunkhouse. The rest of us will go through the main building. A gun would be nice, Billy said. Eddie slapped him on the back. We'll be fine. The dogs sound fine to me. I'd prefer to be out here without a gun than going in there. He pointed toward the open door of the main building. The pair trudged off toward the kennel. Diana held her hand toward the main door. Lead the way, Pete. He pulled his rifle from his shoulder and bolted around in the chamber. Stay close, he grumbled. I need your light. Doc shone his torch on the open door. Diana gasped. I'm not sure there's a lot I can do for this one, Doc said. They all stared at the frozen hand clinging to the door frame, and the lifeless body torn to shreds on the floor just inside. The husky slept at the cage playfully as Billy and Eddie entered the kennels. Where is everyone, guys? Eddie said. They barked back excitedly. They've been fed and watered, Billy said, shining the torch beam through the cage. Whatever happened here happened after these guys were taken care of for the night. He panned the torch beam around the rest of the small building. There's nobody here. Let's check the bunkhouse. Eddie was crouched by the cage. You okay? He poked his fingers through the wire. One of the dogs licked him. I'll be back before we leave, he whispered. The bunkhouse gave off an unwelcome feeling, pitch black and lifeless. Neither man cared to admit it, but under the light of the full moon, the building was damn right creepy. Billy forced the door open. Both men jumped inside. As the door closed, the silence was unnerving. Mist escaped Billy's lips with each breath. "The power's definitely out," Eddie whispered. "How do you know?" Billy asked. "No way the heating would be out in here if it wasn't." The pair walked the length of the bunkhouse. It wasn't the fact they didn't find anyone that worried them most. It was the clear sign of recent activity. Most of the beds were unmade, obviously slept in. Above each bunk were family photographs and posters. There were open journals with recent entries neither man could read, water bottles, food wrappers. It was as if everybody had vanished without warning. "Let's go and try the generator before we go inside the main building," Eddie said. "What?" Billy asked. Eddie slapped him on the back. "Come on, Billy. It's in the next building. You're a magician. You'll have it going in less than 60 seconds. The pair found the door to the small shed containing the generator wide open. A build-up of snow covered the foot of the doorway. "No wonder it's out," Billy grumbled. "I bet the fuel line's frozen." The generator sat on a wooden countertop in the back corner of the room, keeping it off the frozen ground. The smell of kerosene suffocated the air. "What the hell? Eddie, keep the light on this, will ya?" Eddie held the torch high from the doorway. "What do you make of this, Eddie?" Under the light of the torch, 4 deep scratches ran along the outside of the generator. One scratch had severed the fuel line. Kerosene was running out, creating a pool on the floor below. A distant howl carried over the icy wind. Billy never heard it from inside the shed, but Eddie noticed. "I don't know, looks like some sort of animal," Eddie said, his attention on the horizon. Billy shook his head. "What sort of animal have you come across this far inland that could do this?" He rifled through the shelves on the wall. "I don't know," Eddie replied. "Can you fix it?" Billy grabbed the roll of electrician's tape and held it up triumphantly. "As long as it's just the fuel line, we'll be in business in a minute." He joined the ends of the fuel line and wrapped the tape round. The room went dark. "Hey, I need the light!" Eddie held the torch beam on the horizon. "Sorry," Eddie mumbled. He focused the torch beam back toward Billy. "I thought I saw something heading our way through the snow." The dogs began barking from the kennels, not in the friendly way they'd done when Billy and Eddie had been there earlier. Billy finished wrapping the fuel line. He checked the containers under the table. "There you are," he whispered, finding a full one. Billy poured the kerosene into the generator and replaced the cap. Moment of truth. He pulled the cord. The lights of the base flickered as the generator spluttered, threatening to work. "Come on, baby." Billy pulled again as the torch beam left him in darkness again. "God damn it, Eddie!" The generator spluttered to life for good as power to the entire base was restored. Billy turned to the doorway to see it was empty. "Eddie?" He crept to the doorway and peered into the night. With the power restored, he could see a little further, but not much. The wind whipped at his face as it picked up. "Eddie!" The only response came from the dogs barking in the kennel. Billy's eyes fell to the snow outside the doorway and the fresh pool of blood resting on top. Pete edged his way slowly along the corridor, his rifle aimed forward in front of him. Doc and Diana followed close behind. The torn-up body by the door was still firmly in their minds. Doc's torch beam found the bloody handprint. It traced along the wall, disappearing around the corner. The lights activating caught them off guard. Music drifted along the corridor. Doc knew the song well. December 1963 by the Four Seasons. "I didn't expect to hear that song in a Soviet base," he whispered. They rounded the corner. The music was coming from the open door at the end. Pete methodically checked each doorway as they passed. "That's Robert's voice," Diana said. "This is Mawson. Can anybody read me?" The radio transmission was littered with static. Diana stepped into the empty room and grabbed the mic. "Hey Robert, it's Diana. You read?" "Loud and clear," Robert said. "What's going on there?" Diana hesitated. She didn't understand why, but the moment she said it out loud, it would become more real. "We don't know yet. We found one dead. We're still searching." There was a pause at the other end. "Shit," Robert said. "What do you need me to do?" Nothing yet, Diana said. Just stay on the line until you hear from me. Roger that. Be careful out there, guys. Pete led the way into the last room. Bile rose in Doc's throat. A dartboard hung on the wall. A pool table sat in the centre. A bar sat in front of the back wall, littered with half-full glasses. The record player continued to play. Wind and snow billowed through the broken window. The rec room had been the scene of the last stand of Salyut. Ripped up bodies littered the floor, arms cleaved at the elbow, legs separated from bodies, torsos ripped open. Horrified faces stared at the ceiling, looks of terror etched on their faces forever. What happened here? Diana whispered. What could have done this? Doc leant down by the body closest to the door. Some sort of animal attack, he said, studying the wounds. Looks like a bear or something. This ain't no bear attack, Pete grunted. There ain't none out here. Billy burst into the room. Pete drew down with his rifle. Whoa! Billy screamed, shielding his face with his hands. Don't shoot! Pete relaxed. Billy dropped his hands. His eyes found the bodies. Where's Eddie? Diana asked, searching the corridor behind him. Billy stood frozen. Billy, where is Eddie? I thought he was with you guys, Billy stammered. Why would he be in here with us? Billy ignored the question. Diana shook him. Where's Eddie? What happened? I was fixing the generator outside, Billy mumbled. And? Frustration crept into Diana's voice. He was there and then he wasn't, Billy said. He was holding the torch on the generator from the doorway. I turned around and he was gone. Doc and Pete exchanged glances. Doc pulled the climbing axe free from the fingers of the severed arm. I think it's safe to say that we need to find Eddie and get the fuck out of here. A sound from down the hall caught them off guard. It came from a room halfway along. The only closed door in the corridor. Pete crept forward, the others close behind. Maybe it's Eddie, Billy whispered. I doubt it, Doc replied. The door was closed when we came through. No one could have got in front of us. Doc's fingers gripped the door handle. He nodded to Pete, who stood ready with the rifle. Doc used his fingers to count silently to 3. He pushed the door open and stepped back. Pete entered the room. There was a bookshelf. Open maps littered the desk. Crouching in the corner behind the desk, Manya sat rocking backwards and forwards, cradling her knees to her chest. Her dark hair caked to her head with dried blood, tears streaming down her face, tracing lines through the dried blood there. She didn't seem to notice their presence. Doc crept forward and knelt down in front of her. Hey. He reached forward and she flinched away from his hand. I'm not going to hurt you. Diana studied the maps on the desk. The writing was in Russian, but she could see the base marked, as well as Mawson. Between the two was a mark. She wasn't familiar with anything being there. What happened here? Doc whispered. Manya remained silent. She's in shock. We need to get the fuck out of here, Billy said. Agreed, Diana said, still studying the map, but not without Eddie. Can you tell me your name? Doc whispered. Oboriton, Manya said. Okay, Oboriton, are you injured? Pete chuckled. What's so funny? Doc asked. That's not her name, Pete said. Doc felt the heat rise in his face. How do you know? Do you speak Russian? No, a little bit, Pete replied. Diana's impatience was growing by the second. Well, what did she say? Pete's face tensed. Doesn't make sense. I can't be completely sure. But Oboriton translates roughly to werewolf or wolfman. Great, she's nuts, Billy said. Doc's eyes studied Manya. Is she? She's in shock, definitely, but nuts? I don't think so. You saw those bodies in there. Something ripped them apart. Maybe not a werewolf, but it's definitely an apex predator big enough to tear through all those men like they were nothing. Diana knelt down beside Doc. What's your name, honey? I'm Diana. Manya's eyes found Diana, as if noticing her for the first time. What's your name? Manya, she whispered. Diana looked up at Pete. He nodded. That's a name. Okay, Manya. I think you should come with us. This time the girl didn't flinch away as Doc and Diana helped her to her feet. What happened here, Manya? The girl seemed confused, unable to understand their words. Her eyes fell on the map on the desk. She pointed to the mark between Salyut and Mawson. Oboroton, she repeated. Diana started folding maps and documents and placed them inside her coat jacket. Pete, take Billy outside with you and look for Eddie. Stay together, keep an eye on each other. The colour drained from Billy's face. There was blood. What? There was blood on the ground when Eddie went missing. Why didn't you tell us that before? Diana demanded. My mind's a mess from all the shit in the rec room. I didn't remember until just now. Diana glanced towards Pete. Anger flashed on her face. Just do a quick check. Be back here in 10. Pete slapped his hand down firmly on Billy's shoulder. Come on, kid. Won't take long. Diana turned to Doc. I'll update Robert. You check over Manya while we wait for them to get back. That's a lot of blood. Make sure she isn't injured. The dogs were still barking as Pete and Billy trudged their way through the snow. Billy forced the kennel door open and Pete charged in, rifle ready. The huskies weren't in their playful mood anymore. They bared their teeth toward the back corner of the building. The kennel was filled with an acrid smell that hadn't been present last time. Over the sound of the dogs there was the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. Not Billy or Pete. It was inhuman. Billy shone the torch into the corner. The dogs barked with renewed vigour. Billy's legs buckled beneath him as the torch beam settled on Eddie's dead eyes. But that wasn't the most terrifying thing captured in the torchlight. Hunched over Eddie's body, covered head to toe in black fur, was what could only be described as a monster. Its long snout filled with razor-sharp teeth turned toward the light. Its eyes flared. It let out a wall-shaking roar upon seeing the men. Billy dropped to the floor, unable to move. Pete let off a shot that sailed into the monster's chest. It did nothing except incite rage. The beast bounded across the floor with a flash of claws. Pete's arms were cleaved at the elbows. The rifle dropped to the floor in Pete's hands. With a twitch, the next shot cannoned into the wall. The beast grabbed Pete's head between its claws and lifted him off the ground. The sound of cracking bone filled the kennel. Pete screamed as his head was crushed. The dogs barked angrily within the cage as Pete's headless body dropped to the floor. Billy sat frozen as the beast stood over him. Upright on two legs, the beast stood 8 feet tall. Its pointed ears angled back as it sneered down at Billy, baring its teeth. The last word that floated through Billy's mind before it was crushed by the werewolf's jaw was Manya's voice whispering, Oboteran. They should be back by now, Diana said as she entered the room. Doc had finished checking Manya over. He'd cleaned most of the blood from her face, revealing just how pretty she was. Diana hadn't noticed any other women amongst the bodies on the floor in the rec room. She imagined it hadn't been easy at Salyut for Manya. I've let Robert know we're on our way back. Let's go find the others. Hopefully they've found Eddie. Doc gripped the climbing axe tightly in his glove as they crossed the snow toward the kennels. The faint bark of the dogs carried over the icy wind. Do you think they're in there? His voice was barely audible. Only one way to find out, Diana replied. It took a moment for them to realise Manya had stopped. They turned back to see her staring at the kennel. Doc trudged back to her. Come on, you'll freeze. Her eyes never left the kennel. She raised her finger and pointed toward the roof. Oboteran. Doc turned. Through the snow he could make out a large silhouette hunched low on the roof. Despite the darkness, he could see the eyes watching him. What is it? Diana yelled back. She followed Manya's finger back toward the roof of the kennel. The wolf dropped from the kennel and charged forward. Diana trudged back toward Doc and Manya. The wolf charged her down and dropped her face first into the snow. Diana screamed as the werewolf's jaw tore into her back. Doc and Manya rushed forward. Manya kept going past toward the kennels. Doc slammed the pointed end of the climbing axe into the wolf's head, knocking it away. It let out a howl of frustration as it rolled through the snow. the axe still embedded in its head. Doc lifted Diana from the ground and helped her toward the weasel. He chanced to glance back to see the wolf charging at them. Doc ripped the door open and threw Diana inside. He followed and slammed the door closed. The weasel shook as the wolf slammed into the door. You okay, Diana? Jesus, what is that thing? I think so, Diana said. I don't feel anything. Doc ran his eyes over Diana's jacket. You got lucky, he said. The jacket's toast, but it saved your skin. Doc jumped away from the door as the razor-sharp claws tore through it. He climbed into the front. The engine choked but refused to start. Come on, you piece of shit! The engine continued to whine. He looked up at the eyes of the werewolf, staring at him through the windshield, its breath leaving a patch of fog. Its razor-sharp claws pushed hard against the glass. The windshield began to splinter. The werewolf's head snapped toward the kennels. The huskies charged forward through the snow. The wolf leapt from the weasel to face them, letting out a deafening roar. The pack never backed down. They fanned out, teeth bared. Manya crept out from the kennel and circled her way toward the weasel while the werewolf was occupied. As she opened the door to climb into the weasel beside Doc, the werewolf snapped its eyes toward her. The huskies chose that moment to strike. The first leapt on its back, sinking its teeth into the werewolf's shoulder. The others followed the lead and attacked where they could. On its hind legs, the werewolf reared up. The pack hung from its legs and arms. The remaining husky leapt on the werewolf's chest, knocking it over into the snow. The scene became a blur of roars, snaps and snarls. The weasel burst to life and Doc drove away. What the fuck was that thing? He whispered. Obateran, Manya replied. The weasel spluttered and coughed along the snow as the lights of Mawson Base drifted into view on the horizon. Come on, just a little further, Doc whispered. The snowfall had set heavy on the return trip. Doc wasn't sure he'd been going the right way. The lights ahead were a welcome sight. But until the weasel made it back, he would not allow himself the luxury to relax. Good job, Diana said, poking her head through from the back seat. Don't worry about driving to the shed, just pull up out the front. Doc didn't see the point in telling her he'd already decided to do that. Manya sat in silence in the passenger seat. Doc had been keeping an eye on her. She seemed to be over the shock she'd been in when they first found her. If it hadn't been for her releasing the dogs, he and Diana would be dead. Doc owed her a thank you, but he was going to need someone who spoke Russian to deliver it. We need to let everyone know what happened, Diana said, but we need to find out what Manya knows first. Doc pulled the weasel up outside the main building. Robert was waiting by the open door. How much do we tell them? Doc asked. They're going to think we're crazy if we tell them what happened. It's a chance we'll have to take, Diana said. She bit her lip. Doc turned to face her. How do you find out what she knows? He nodded subtly towards Manya. She was eyeing Robert suspiciously. Well, that's the easy part, Diana said. Robert will interpret. Doc shook his head before he responded. Yeah, because his brief from the radio transmissions was so thorough. Diana kicked the weasel door open. He's the best we've got. Where's everyone else? Robert said, running up to help them out. His eyes drifted to Manya. And who's this? Doc raised his eyes toward the ceiling of the weasel. The explanation was going to fall to Diana. Robert, the others aren't. What? What do you mean? Robert's eyes drifted to the horizon. I'll get the other vehicle ready. We'll go and get them. They're dead, Diana said. Robert met the news with silence. This is Manya. She's the only survivor from Salyut. What do you mean dead? What happened out there? Diana placed her hands gently on Robert's shoulders. I'll explain everything. But first, I need you to get information out of Manya. She only speaks Russian. Robert was still in shock. Dead? What happened? I need you to focus, Robert. We need the information Manya has. I've told you I'll explain everything. A distant howl carried with the snow. For now, we need to get everyone together and get inside. Diana led Robert toward the door. Doc helped Manya down from the weasel. She stopped short of the door to the base. Doc shoved her toward the door. We need to get inside. Zdat, Manya said, wiggling free of his grip. We don't have time for this. This time Doc heard it too. The faint barking drew closer. Through the falling snow, 3 shapes rushed toward the base. "It's the dogs," Diana uttered. They jumped on Manu without slowing down, knocking her to the ground. They licked her face furiously. Doc kept his eye on the darkness. "Looks like it's just the 3 of them." "Then that other thing won't be far behind," Diana said. "We need to get inside." "What other thing?" Robert asked. Diana set the cup of hot cocoa on the table in front of Manya. "Spazzy, she said as she picked it up. The 3 huskies lay quietly on the floor around her chair. "What she said?" Diana asked. Manya took a sip of the cocoa. The colour was gone from Robert's face. "Come on, stay with me here. What's she told you?" Robert's blank face found Diana's impatient stare. "What happened out there, Diana? What this girl's saying is crazy." Diana rested her hands on her hips. "Okay," Robert said. "Just remember this was her story. I'm just repeating it." It was the first time Manya could leave the base on her own. Darkness filled the sky, but the absence of the moon meant it was daytime. It was the first time in months that the wind was manageable, the first time the air was free of snow. Radio transmissions came through with ease, free of the usual static and choppy words. Manya hummed her favourite song as she crawled the Sprite snow vehicle over the snow. The beam of the vehicle's lights crept over a dark shape in the distance. Manya slowed as the lights bounced off the entrance to the cave. "Am I lost?" she wondered. She studied the open map on the passenger seat. If she was where she thought she was, there shouldn't be a cave here. The cold snapped at Manya's face as she jumped down from the vehicle. She pulled the hood of her jacket tight around her face. The vehicle engine hummed behind her as her eyes studied the cave entrance under the lights. There were a few small holes in the snow cover, but no gaps big enough to squeeze through. Manya knew it was too big of a risk to explore the cave alone, especially if she'd strayed from the path she was supposed to be on. But a little peek wouldn't hurt. She grabbed a climbing axe and torch from the toolbox and struggled through the snow back to the cave entrance. On tiptoe, Manya peered through a hole no bigger than a coffee mug. She was met by nothing but pitch black. She tried to angle the torch beam for a better view, but the hole was too small. Manya attacked the hole with the climbing axe. The snow proved stubborn. She was left breathless by the time it fell away. Sweat covered her brow beneath her hood. The hole was now the size of a dinner plate. Manya panned the torch beam. The darkness seemed alive, threatening to swallow the light. The inside of the cave appeared as unremarkable as the outside, just more snow. Manya pressed her face closer. It did nothing to combat the darkness. There was still no way to see how far back the cave went. A dark shadow flicked through the beam of light, completely blocking it out. Manya blinked. It was so fast she wasn't sure if it had interrupted the light at all. Curiosity took hold. She poked her head further into the hole. Manya couldn't see it, but felt the change in the air as the claw slashed through the darkness. The shock sent her backwards to the snow below. The silver claws retracted back through the hole. A snarl of frustration echoed within the cave. The powerful arm, completely covered in hair, ripped back through the hole. The claws dug into the snow of the outside. Snow tore away as the hole grew. The first arm was joined by a second. Manya stumbled back to the vehicle. The arms continued tearing at the snow, the hole growing bigger and bigger. Now the hole was large enough for Manya to fit through. It wouldn't be long now, and the hole would be big enough for whatever was in there to squeeze out. The engine whined as Manya put a foot down and headed back towards Salyut. Diana never moved and never interrupted as Robert told Manya's story. They never believed what she told them when she arrived back at Salyut, Robert said. They were interested in the cave and sent a 3-man team to search it. Contact with the team was lost and they never returned. Another team was going to search for them the next day, but Robert didn't want to continue. But Diana wanted to know. Go on. Robert's eyes dropped to the table. She said a werewolf attacked the base and killed everyone. His lips curled into a smile. You wouldn't be smiling if you'd seen it, Diana said. That thing attacked me. If it hadn't been for Doc fighting it off and Manya's quick thinking to release the dogs, I'd be dead too. Diana pulled the map from inside her jacket. Ask her to point out the cave. Robert spoke quickly. Manya's finger fell on the same mark she'd pointed out earlier. The mark between Salliott and Mawson. Doc knocked on the door. "They're all waiting in the rec room when you're ready." Diana folded the map. Robert's eyes fell on her back as Diana left the room, and the giant tear in the back of her jacket. Diana never saw the rec room this quiet. They met her with a range of looks as she entered, ranging from fear all the way through to anger. Doc was waiting for her by the bar. "How much have you told them?" she whispered. "Bare minimum." "Which is what?" Doc sighed. "I know most of the crew at Salliott are dead, and that Eddie, Billy and Pete didn't come back with us." Robert crept into the back of the room. Manya drew stairs as she entered behind him, followed by the Huskies. "Thank you all for your patience," Diana began. "Not like we had a choice," Vince Meyer snapped, elbowing the man beside him. "Where are the others? Don't tell us this is a new exchange program and you traded them in for the girl and the 3 dogs." His comment drew nervous laughter. Diana wasn't in the mood. "They're dead, Vince, along with the rest of the Salliott crew." Her words had the desired effect, and Vince shut his mouth. After a moment of stunned silence, the question started. "How? What happened?" Diana raised her hands and waited for quiet. "There was an animal attack. It got inside the base at Salliott and it tore through the entire crew except for one." Vince was done being quiet. "There's nothing out here that can do anything like that. We saw what was left and they were all torn apart." Diana had no intention of being shouted over. "The same thing attacked when we arrived and it killed our guys." Robert spoke up. "Why don't you tell them what it was?" The room went quiet again. "It was a wolf." Vince laughed. "So a wolf killed what, 20 people on its own?" "They say it was a werewolf," Robert said, the smile back on his face. "Yeah, a werewolf, huh? Great joke. Now where are the others hiding?" "They're dead." Doc turned to Diana. "Let them head out there for themselves if they think it's a joke." He turned to Vince. "You certainly won't be missed. And you feel free to head out there with him, Robert. I'm tired of your shit too." Vince jumped to his feet and got in Doc's face. "Here's what I think happened. I think there was a wolf or something and you turned tail and ran." Neither man backed down. "Did you even see them die? Or are you guessing?" Doc stayed silent. "That's what I thought." The power in the base cut out. A low growl from the dogs broke the silence of the room. "Guess you'd better go out there and fix the generator, Robert," Doc said. "Why me?" It was Doc's turn to laugh. "It was all a joke to you 30 seconds ago, remember? You think we're lying? So there's nothing to be scared of. I'm sure you're right. There's nothing out there to rip your insides out, so get going." Robert dropped his eyes. "I don't know how to fix it. That's Billy's job." "Nonsense," Doc said. "You're the radio man. I'm sure you'll figure it out. I have every confidence in you. Besides, Billy's not dead, remember? He's waiting outside to help you." "Enough," Diana said. "No one's going outside." Vince walked to the windows and peered into the billowing snow. "I don't think you have the right to tell any of us what to do anymore." He turned back to face the others. "I say we take a crew back to Salliott and get the other guys." The smash caught everyone off guard. Glass showered Vince as the claws of the werewolf tore into his chest. His scream carried outside into the snow as it ripped him through the broken window. The dogs erupted with barks and snarls. Panic swelled the room. Some men rushed to the window and climbed out. Others left through the door. Diana's protests went unheard over the commotion. They all raced into the snow after Vince. "God damn it!" Diana ran after them. Doc followed but paused beside Robert. "Not bad for something we made up, eh?" The snow whipped Vince's face as it dragged him. Sharp pain filled his chest as the claws ripped free. Blood poured into the snow as he climbed to his knees. The lights of Mawson were far off in the distance. He tried to stand. The pain dropped him back to his knees. The heavy breathing circled him. He tried to see, but it moved with too much speed. Faint voices carried over the wind. The others were looking for him. The breathing continued to circle. Vince realised he was the bait. Doc struggled to catch Diana. "Come back, you can't help them." He grabbed her by the arm. "Let me go," she snapped. "They're my responsibility." Doc held firm. "You told them to stay inside. They didn't listen. This is on them. Now get back inside before you die with them." The first scream cut through the air. I'm here! Vince yelled. He could see the shadows hurrying toward him. The men rushed into view. He's over here. He's still alive. The shadow appeared between them. The first man flew through the air and landed in front of Vince. Half his face was gone. Blood gurgled from the gaping hole as the wide-eyed man struggled for breath. A chorus of screams erupted. The wolf cut the men down one at a time, charging through. In the distant light of Mawson, streams of black filled the air as blood left their bodies. Legs and arms flew like debris in a strong wind. One man was completely cut in half. The top half remained in the air for a fraction of a second longer than the bottom. The sound of the body tearing in half caused Vince to turn away. Vomit spewed from his mouth in a steaming pile beside him. Vince turned back to nothing. No screams, no movement. The breathing was circling him again. Wind left his body as he was thrown through the air. The snow was cold on his back. Before he could move, the snarling face was there. The smell of death filled his nostrils as the hot breath filled his face like mist. The drool mixed with blood was warm and sticky as it drizzled over his face. Claws dug into his chest. Vince let out a scream of agony as they slowly bored their way through his ribcage. The last thing his wide eyes got to see was his still beating heart ripped free of his chest. "It'll be coming here next," Doc shouted as he followed Diana through the rec room window. "Where's everyone else?" Robert stammered. Diana shook her head. "Just us left." They all heard the howl. Doc started smashing spirit bottles around the bar. "What are you doing?" Diana asked. "We lure the fucker in here and we burn it." Diana started helping. Robert stood frozen in place. Manya tried to keep the dogs calm. They were itching for the fight to come. "I've got to get some stuff from the office. Keep going here." Doc kicked the door open. He grabbed a bottle of rubbing alcohol down and stuffed gauze through the top. He turned to leave and stopped. The crisp pack of holiday cigarettes was sitting on his desk with his silver lighter resting beside. "Been hours since I've had a smoke," he thought. He picked them both up. The heavy breathing from the broken rec room window gained all their attention. The eyes of the werewolf locked onto Diana as it clambered through. "Run!" Diana yelled. "Get to the weasel, I'll meet you out there." Robert failed to move. Manya grabbed his shoulder and dragged him to the door. The dogs reluctantly followed. The werewolf craned its head low to avoid the ceiling. Its claws tapped the floor as it stepped forward. Diana threw the bottle of spirits she held. It smashed against the werewolf's chest. It let out an angry wall-shaking roar. "Hey, arsehole!" Doc yelled. He lit the gauze in the alcohol bottle and used the flame to light the cigarette between his lips. The wolf turned to face him. "You ready?" he said to Diana. She nodded. The bottle sailed through the air, crashing at the wolf's feet. The flame flashed and engulfed the werewolf. Diana rushed past. The claws sailed toward her. She dropped and rolled under them on the way through. Doc helped her up. Howls of pain trailed them as they sprinted away. "Go, go, go!" Doc screamed, seeing Manya and Robert waiting by the door. They struggled through the snow toward the weasel. Manya jumped in the back, followed by the dogs. Doc jumped in front and started the engine. Diana jumped in beside him. Robert tripped face first in the snow. He pulled himself up with the open door of the weasel. "Quit fucking around and get in!" The entire base was going up in flames. Robert screamed as the jaw of the werewolf tore through his shoulder. The side of the werewolf's face was burnt. The skin had melted over one eye. It released Robert. He tried to speak, but only coughed blood. His arm at the shoulder dropped into the snow beside him. He stretched his other arm out toward Diana. With a swipe of a claw, that arm fell to the snow as well. The wolf's jaw clamped around Robert's head. It sounded like a crushed walnut as his skull collapsed. "Pull the door shut!" Diana slammed it and Doc took off. "Where are we going?" Diana asked. Doc kept his eyes ahead. "The only place we can get to. We're going back to Salyut." Halfway back to Salyut, the engine to the weasel gave its last death rattle and stopped dead in the middle of the snow. The Amory Ice Shelf, 1963. George Pearson opened his eyes to darkness. The cold cut at his bare skin. The familiar fresh smell of snow was mixed with something else. Something acrid. This smell was also familiar to George. The copper tinge crossed with a sick damp. The smell of blood. He knew where he was. George was back in the cave he'd called home for many months. His bare feet crunched across the icy floor as he fumbled for his desk. The clink of the kerosene lantern echoed through the cave as his fingers found it. George lit it and held it aloft. The shadow of the flame flickered and danced across the icy walls. His gasp was involuntary. Under the flame of the lantern, George got his first glimpse of his handiwork. Bodies littered the floor from his desk all the way to the path leading to the cave entrance. I failed. George placed the lantern back on his desk. He knew what must be done. Isolation wasn't enough. He sat, pen in hand, and worked on his last words. George sought the solitude of Antarctica as a means of protection. Not for himself, but for everyone else. A solo position at a lone radio tower miles away from any other human soul seemed perfect for a man with his condition. George learned quickly how wrong he'd been. The lunar effects of the moon were very different in Antarctica. An affliction that lasted mere hours in the civilized world was amplified by the South Pole and the position of the moon. The first time he changed, he discovered the effects were extended. The change lasted 3 days. On the next occasion, it lasted even longer. George had no waking memory or control during the change. He knew on the next occasion, his other self, his dark half, would have enough time to reach any number of surrounding bases. Even worse, if enough time passed without transmitting from the tower, others would seek him out. George's biggest fear was that the longer he stayed, the more likely the change would become permanent. George had taken matters into his own hands. He'd set off with no destination in mind, with supplies and enough items to alleviate boredom. George couldn't leave Antarctica for months. To keep everyone safe, he needed to hide, so no one knew where to find him. Then George had to hope his other self wouldn't go searching them out. One thing George failed to consider was that others would search for him. He turned back to the bodies on the cave floor, the poor souls, with great intentions. Their crime? They wanted to save him. Those intentions had cost them their lives. George finished the letter and signed and dated it. He lamented his curse. He felt the cold, but couldn't freeze. He enjoyed food, but could live without it. Worst of all, he felt old, but he never aged. He'd tried taking his own life, but the dark half couldn't be killed. He would simply wake, completely fine again. A ragged breath from behind caught his attention. He lifted the lantern and turned and found the terrified eyes staring his way. Tears welled in George's eyes. This was just a boy. Couldn't be older than 20. The boy clutched at the large wound in his stomach. A pool of expanding blood beneath him. The boy's chest rose and fell rapidly. There was nothing to be done for him. Even with urgent medical attention, his chances would have been slim. George's fingers found the shovel handle. The boy tried to speak as George stood over him. George lifted the shovel. His eyes met those of the terrified boy. "I'm sorry." George brought the blade of the shovel down with a grunt. Sweat dripped from his brow as he leaned on the shovel. 10 graves in all. He collected the dynamite from the box beside his desk and lined the snow around the cave entrance. Others would come. They would search for the searchers. This needed to be done. His sanity would leave him with an eternity in a tomb. But it was better than more blood on his hands. George lit the fuse and stepped into the cave. Diana leaned back against the headrest of her seat and closed her eyes. The dogs whined behind her. "We need to keep moving," Doc said. "That thing won't be far behind us." What's the point? Diana breathed. If we go on foot in this, she motioned to the snow falling against the windscreen, that thing either catches us or we freeze to death. Doc's hands tightened on the steering wheel. So you want to just wait for it here, like a sandwich in a lunchbox? Diana shrugged. Her eyes stayed closed. Manya spoke before Doc could launch into a tirade. Carta. What? Doc turned to the back seat. Carta, Manya repeated, motioning with her hands. Diana opened her eyes. Do you know what she's on about? Doc asked. Diana studied the girl's gestures. I think so. Diana pulled the map from inside her jacket and handed it over. Manya unfolded it. Doc switched his torch on and held the light up for her. Manya's fingers fell to the cave. Bashera, she declared. She's right, Doc said. Can't be far from here. What do you say, Diana? We can take shelter, wait for the storm to pass. We'll still probably freeze, but maybe it'll give us a puncher's chance. Why not? Diana said. The three grabbed what gear they could carry from the back of the weasel. Torches, some food and water. Honestly, this is guesswork. But if we are where I think we are, the cave is less than half a mile away. The biggest danger is we go straight past it. Doc tied a rope around their waists to tether them together. The dogs, unfazed by the cold, stuck close by Manya. Manya's ragged breathing echoed in her ears beneath the hood of her jacket. In an exercise of futility, she wrapped her arms around her chest. The rope pulled at her waist. Doc and Diana were no more than black shapes a few metres ahead of her. Despite the falling snow, the area seemed familiar to her. The gentle slopes to many wouldn't have appeared any different to anyone else, but to Manya, she knew they were close. Through the falling snow, off to one side, she saw it, nothing more than a black shape, but she knew they'd found it. Zdat! The rope tugged her forward. Manya gripped it and pulled hard. What? Doc shouted. His cry barely carried the distance to Manya's ears. Manya waved both arms frantically toward the cave. Doc and Diana's eyes followed. Nice spot! He knew they got lucky. He and Diana would have walked straight past it. The three changed direction and headed for the cave. Diana's body trembled beneath her jacket as the dark mouth of the cave swallowed her. The beam of her torch lit the path ahead. The cave path narrowed toward a corner. They untied the rope from their waists, and Diana looped it around her shoulder. The trio struggled to keep their footing on the slippery ground as the path sloped. Someone's seen out a few winters in here, Doc said as the path opened into a cavern. Their torch beams scanned, revealing a modest cot, some strewn clothing and a desk. The dogs investigated the clothing. The fur on their backs raised, coupled with low growls. They didn't like what their noses told them. Diana and Doc studied the pages of writing at the desk, while Manya tried to settle the dogs. Who's George Pearson? Doc whispered. He continued rifling through the various pages. Whoever he is, it looks like he went crazy in here. He noticed Diana focused on one page in particular. Diana? Oh, sorry. She handed the page to Doc. I think George was the werewolf. Doc's eyes scanned the page. His eyes finally fell on the date at the bottom. 1963. Oh shit. This guy's been trying to stop himself for years. How the hell are we supposed to stop him? That's not the problem for right now, Diana replied. It's coming back here. We need to find somewhere to lie low. What do you propose? Diana flashed the beam of her torch to the back wall of the cavern. The cave keeps going. Maybe there's another way out. The roar echoed through the cavern from the cave entrance. After you, Doc gestured to the opening. The dogs charged toward the cave entrance. Manya chased after them. Don't! Doc turned back to Diana. If we're not back soon, go without us. Doc took off, leaving Diana alone in the cavern. She picked up an old map from the corner of the desk, as well as all the handwritten notes. She stuffed them into her jacket. Her eyes fell on the box of dynamite beside the desk and the loop of fuse cord. The roar echoed along the cave path. Manya, stop! Doc didn't need the torch to see the hulking shadow standing at the cave entrance. The dogs launched themselves through the air without hesitation. Manya screamed. The werewolf caught one of the dogs mid-air and slammed it into the cave wall. It fell limp to the floor. Manya rushed to it. We have to go now! Doc grabbed her by the waist. He screamed in agony as the werewolf's jaw clamped down hard on his forearm. He punched at the wolf's head with his free hand. The remaining dogs launched onto the werewolf's back and tore at its shoulders. The werewolf released Doc's arm. Come on! He dragged Manya up and he followed her back down the cavern. Diana saw Doc nursing his arms. Are you okay? I'll be fine, just get moving, it's right behind us. The chorus of roars and growls from the cave entrance ceased. Diana hurried deeper into the cave, half walking, half running. She cursed the slippery ground that prevented her from moving any faster. The roar behind was gaining ground. The path opened to a second cavern and a deep ravine. The torch beam found nothing but black as Diana aimed it down. Now what? Doc asked. Manya tugged at his jacket and pointed to a shelf that jutted out a foot from the wall that circled one half of the ravine. I've got a plan, but you're not going to like it, Diana said. Well, I'm all ears, Doc replied. Have you still got your lighter? Doc handed it over. Go out to the ledge and hold on. Tether yourselves together. She tossed the rope to Manya. Even with the language barrier, she understood. She tied it around herself and then helped Doc. The pair inched their way across the shelf. The werewolf stepped into the cavern. Its eyes locked onto Diana. The wolf dipped its head and let out a roar that echoed off the walls. Diana pulled a stick of dynamite from her pocket and lit the fuse. Are you crazy? Doc screamed. Diana ignored him and focused on the werewolf. Come on, just a little closer. The werewolf lunged forward. Diana dropped the stick of dynamite and ran for the ice shelf. The explosion was deafening. The ground beneath Diana's feet gave way. She lunged for the shelf. Her arms dug in as the ground disappeared, leaving her bottom half dangling over the ravine. The werewolf tumbled down into the black abyss with an echoing roar that grew distant. Diana pulled herself up onto the shelf. Are you okay? Doc yelled. Diana nodded. The shelf cracked beneath Manya's feet. She let out a scream as she fell. Doc took the slack of the rope. Manya's hands found the shelf on Diana's side. Diana lifted her up. The women stared across the gap in the shelf in despair. Doc was stranded. Jump! You can make it, Diana said. It's too far. I can't pull myself up with one arm. We'll pull you up. Doc shook his head. I'm dead weight. The sudden pull will just drag all three of us into the ravine. I'm not just going to leave you, Diana said. The roar echoed from the bottom of the ravine. Doc untied the rope from his waist. I'm not going to give you a choice. Now get going. Diana and Manya stayed put. Not without you. A second roar echoed, closer than before. You haven't got much time. That thing is climbing back up. Go now! Manya pulled at Diana's arm, dragging her away. Doc slumped down, his legs dangling over the ravine. He watched the werewolf climb out on the opposite side. It studied Doc for a moment and scanned the gap. It stepped toward the ice shelf, finding it too narrow. With a frustrated grunt, it left the ravine and headed back into the cave. Doc pulled his pack of cigarettes from his pocket and placed one between his lips. He searched for his lighter, then remembered he'd given it to Diana. Perfect. Diana's breathing was ragged by the time she reached the cave entrance. She knew they didn't have much time. Help me! Manya stared back at her in confusion. Diana slammed dynamite into the outside of the cave entrance. Manya understood as Diana handed her dynamite. The hulking shadow came into sight. Doc removed his jacket. He stared down at his arm in amazement. The wound had scarred over. It was perfectly fine. He eyed the gap in the ice shelf. Without a second thought, he leapt. The werewolf's rage-filled eyes stared the women down at the cave mouth. Diana hurried to tie all the fuse cord off to connect the dynamite. It knows, she realised. The werewolf stepped toward them. It swatted Manya away, knocking her metres into the snow. Diana fumbled with the lighter, the snow stopping the wick from catching. Light the fucking fuse, Diana! Doc screamed as he sprinted toward her. He dropped to the ground, his body contorted and twisted. The sound of splintering bone erupted, his skin stretched. "Light the fuse!" he growled through clenched teeth as his jaw lengthened. The wick caught and the fuse sparked to life. The werewolf picked her up from the ground and ragdolled her back inside the cave. Diana clutched her head as it slammed into the wall. The werewolf stood over her, its face inches from her own, saliva dripping from its open mouth. Diana's terrified eyes stared death in the face. Her fingers fumbled her pocket, finding the last stick of dynamite. She lit the fuse and jammed it into the werewolf's mouth. It raised its claws. Diana closed her eyes, waiting for the end. A second roar erupted. The second werewolf dug its claws in and tossed the wolf back into the cave. The explosion was deafening. Blood rained. Nothing of the werewolf remained. Diana stared up. "Doc?" The new werewolf picked Diana up from the ground, inches from its face. "Doc, please!" The werewolf roared in her face. She closed her eyes. Her stomach dropped as she was thrown, and she sailed through the air and landed on the soft snow. The explosion was seconds later. The cave mouth collapsed in on itself. Diana found Manya uninjured. They struggled through the snow back to the weasel. Once inside, Diana studied the handwritten notes and the map she'd swiped from the cave. "There's a radio tower not far from here. George used to work there." Manya stared back in confusion. Diana laughed. "If we make it to the tower, it's going to be one hell of a boring winter for conversation." The summer sun shone brightly in the sky as Manya and Diana stood outside the collapsed cave entrance. Diana had spent the rest of the winter in the radio tower, studying George's notes. It was a guess, but if Doc was still alive in there, he was probably human again. If she could get him away from Antarctica, Doc's changes should theoretically be restricted to the night of the full moon. The girls chipped away at the ice. Diana made a small hole. She shone the torch through. "Doc, are you in there?" "Did you bring my lighter?" he responded. "I'm dying for a cigarette." If you like what you heard, please like and share the video. Please leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. And remember, the dark plays tricks with our minds. But sometimes it's not a trick. Sometimes there really is something there.